there's that. We are in Acts 26. Paul is in front of King Agrippa. It's not necessary that you go to Acts 26, since I'm going to emphasize one particular phrase this morning that I have for 2 weeks been talking about, and saying that I am going to talk a little bit of New Covenant eschatology this morning, and so I'm going to do that. Verse 7 of chapter 26, actually starting at verse 6. Paul is arguing to King Agrippa, and he says, I now stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. Fathers is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Consistently, that is the terminology. Verse 7, he says, unto which promise our 12 tribes, instantly serving God day and night, hope to come. Present tense. A present hope of the 12 tribes of Israel, because it is a promise that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. After the cross, after the resurrection, Paul continues to talk of the ongoing hope of the 12 tribes. Now, we're going to do some big theology constructs this morning. And in so doing, some of this is going to be review for you. Those of you who were part of our Wednesday night Revelation study, some of this you're going to say, yeah, I know this, Jim. Bear with me, because the more I talk about this stuff, the more I realize how largely unknown it is in the church world. People don't have a good historic grasp of the progressive revelation of God in His Bible. So we're going to have to do some big picture work this morning, and then we're going to do some very specific stuff. Basic question. Where would Paul, who is constantly using the Old Testament scripture as the basis for his entire theology, where would Paul get this idea that the resurrection, specifically, which is what he's called into question for here, that the resurrection from the dead is the ongoing and present hope of the 12 tribes of Israel? How could Paul make that kind of a comment? Now remember, he's in front of King Agrippa, who is from the Herodian line. Idumeans who have been ruling over the Jews for years. And so Paul is happy to speak to Agrippa, because Agrippa is familiar with the history and the customs of Judaism. And so Paul is free to speak in very Judaistic, Israelitish terms here, and to say that I am called in question of the hope that was given to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which hope is the hope of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, as he's speaking this in a historic framework, the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 northern tribes that were taken away from King Solomon and given to his servant Jeroboam, the whole of Israel, the 12 tribes collectively, was divided between Solomon and Jeroboam. Jeroboam got those northern 10 tribes, and the lower 2 tribes and the Levites that worked in the temple. The lower kingdom from that point forward became known as Judah, the chief tribe of the lower kingdom. So you had Judah, you had Benjamin, and you had the Levites in the temple. And from that point forward, they were known as the house of Judah. It's very important, very specific nomenclature, because every time in the Bible you see the term house of Judah, you are speaking of the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of Judah, and the Levites that serve in the temple. So you've got to know that. Then every time you see the phrase house of Israel, you're talking about the northern 10 tribes that were divided from Solomon's kingship, and they immediately, under the leadership of Jeroboam, went chasing after other gods. Jeroboam, politically wise, spiritually foolish, realized that once this division took place, if the members of the northern tribes realized that the worship of God took place in Jerusalem, they would continue to connect with Jerusalem. And so he was a big advocate of introducing foreign gods into Israelitish culture to separate them from their historic roots with the southern kingdom. Jeroboam did this to make himself the ruler, the absolute ruler and king over the area and the tribes that he was given. So this ongoing apostasy among the northern kingdoms included things like not keeping God's Sabbaths, particularly the 7-year Sabbath, where the land had to lay fallow every 7th year, and God would provide for them during that whole year that they were not allowed to plant or grow. And they weren't keeping things like his year of Jubilee, when all the land would go back to the specific designations that God had given for it. So after years of this kind of abrogation of God's rules and laws, God got tired of it and very specifically sent prophets to say to Israel, the northern kingdom, I'm going to put you in bondage. I'm going to take you out of that land because you haven't recognized that it's my land and I gave it to you and I divided it up and you're supposed to let it lay and have its rest and have its Sabbaths. You haven't kept any of that, so I'm going to put you in bondage. And he brought down the Assyrians, and the Assyrians came in and conquered the northern 10 tribes and took them into what is called the Assyrian captivity. From that point forward, those northern 10 tribes never returned to the land of Canaan. Later, under King Cyrus, after the Assyrians were conquered by the Babylonians were conquered by the Medo-Persians, Isaiah, 150 years in advance, named King Cyrus by name and said that he was going to let the people go back to their land, rebuild the temple, rebuild Jerusalem. All of that happened, but when the Israelites, the northern tribe Israelites, came back to Canaan, they found that their land was occupied because the Assyrians had put people into that land to occupy it and keep it and farm it and everything else. So the northern tribes became known by the nomenclature of the lost tribes because they then were scattered throughout Middle Asia and Europe. They are effectively lost to history. However, it's very important, and I point this out all the time, that when Jesus sent his apostles out to go preach, when he sent them to preach specifically the gospel of the kingdom, he said, don't go into the way of the Gentiles, don't go into the way of the Samaritans, go first to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, once you get the big historic frame, you understand what he just said. When he says lost tribes of house of Israel, he's saying those scattered people of the northern kingdom. Not Judah. The house of Judah was still intact. We'll talk about them in a minute. But the house of Israel, who never returned to their land, scattered. Nevertheless, Jesus said, go preach to them the kingdom. And that would be really important for them because they are the people who are the descendants of the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they have all these promises concerning a future gathering and a kingdom. And so Jesus says, go and preach the gospel of the kingdom to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which means that they were findable, they were locatable during Jesus' time. If they were locatable during Jesus' time, we can guess that Paul could also locate them a mere 30 years later. Okay with that? So Paul is standing before King Agrippa and saying, I am here in question of the resurrection, which is the promise made to the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which promise the 12 tribes hope for. Where does he get that? Where is the basis of his argument that the 12 tribes collectively hope for a future resurrection? It has to be in the Bible somewhere for him to be that firm about it. I'm going to show you this morning where it is. I argue for biblical continuity. There is a great weight of thought out there in the church world that argues for a biblical discontinuity. And what I mean by that is they see the coming of Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and the onset of the new covenant as somehow being completely disjointed from everything that went before it. That all of that long history of God dealing with human beings on earth and with particular people, Israel, who he calls Israel my chosen, Jacob mine elect, that somehow once Christ came and died, buried, resurrected, that